Thank you. Hi, guys. Hey, I would first like to thank David for setting up my presentation. Is David here? His polyrhythms were absolutely wonderful. I think we all really enjoyed that. And keep that in mind as we step through this presentation. You're going to see a lot of parallels between what he was talking about with music and rhythm and African cosmology. Given an unknowable future, innovation is crucial. But a lot of people, particularly business people, think of innovation strictly as a steady process of order, when in fact, it's one of disorder. It's a mixture of disorder and order, and that combination is going to be the essence of my talk today. We're going to be discussing a dichotomy between success and failure and what it really means. Now, people think of success primarily as stability, balance, steadiness, regular rhythm, linear process, perfect steps, 1, 2, 3, not disrupted, and no risk, risk averse. Failure, on the other hand, is seen as instability, imbalance, and unsteadiness. Nonlinear process with hiccups along the way, unknowns happening anyway along the path, and risk. The terrible, terrible, terrible attitude of taking risk that some people think is terrible. We're going to show that it's not the case. Now let's look at innovation, because as I mentioned, innovation is crucial to meeting an unknowable future. The elements of innovation, interestingly enough, are tension, changing perspective, and conflict. Now that sounds a lot like failure, doesn't it? It's really interesting. So you have this opposition between what the elements of innovation equate more with the elements of failure than they do with the typical perception of what success is, particularly from a business point of view. Risk averse, don't try anything new, orderly process. So success, the proper way to have success and innovation is disciplined opposition, and we're going to go through and talk about what that means. First of all, it means working within constraints, but constraints not that inhibit creativity, but that provide a framework for innovation that can focus ideas and resources into the area in business, for example, that will be more effective, that will create a framework for instability. So constraints, as Charles Eames once said, he said, design is constraints. A lot of young designers seem to think that constraints will inhibit their creativity, which is really not the case. It focuses it, if they really think about that. And so by having the constraints, you create this boundary and this framework, which is really the context of what you're designing for. So rather than limiting creativity, it just provides some boundaries to work within. So you should allow instability to move within those boundaries, nudge it back a little bit if you see it getting out of the boundary, and there may be a case when you want it to go outside for some reason. But it's still within a framework. And obviously, contextualize risk. The way to look at risk not as something that's bad. Obviously, you can't go out and just take risk arbitrarily and without some thought. But contextualizing risk within that bounded instability, within that framework of constraints, will then focus your attention to the mission that you're doing. And interestingly enough, you have this balance between instability and stability, between unbalance and balance, between unsteadiness and steadiness, and between nonlinear process and a linear process. So failure has some advantages. And in my experience, this is one of the worst attitudes that I've ever faced in companies where they're really averse to failure. They want to do everything perfect. They try to get it all right the first time. The companies that are not risk averse are the leaders, as far as I'm concerned, and there's a lot of good proof of that. So, because failure provides insights, important insight. It tells you what not to do. So how can you learn what not to do if you don't fail? This is a diagram, simple, black and white, that typifies Western thought, generally. And that is, there is no gray. There's black and white. There's life and death. There's up and down. There's bad and good. Whereas Eastern philosophy starts putting these things together. And this is exactly the point that was being made earlier about African cosmology and the way this thing comes together. And it was beautifully demonstrated through the rhythm and through the music that was shown today. I couldn't believe it when he was doing that. I said, oh my gosh, what a perfect setup for my presentation. I've often heard that this represents bad marriage, that represents good marriage. And I can attest to the fact that those two words that, that typify a successful marriage, you know what those are? Yes, dear. Yeah, right. So this, in essence, this represents that. So it's, it's harmony, it's collaboration, it's getting along with each other, it's respecting the other person's view, not just saying, I'm right, you're wrong. And of course, the early Eastern philosophers had it right. When they looked at the universe, it's composed of polar opposites. That polar opposition, again, I relate back to the earlier presentation when he talked about quantum physics. Modern science has proved that this Eastern thought, where they looked at yin-yang, positive and negative, was verified in modern science through quantum physics and other aspects of the study of science. So they were right. So as opposed to the Western point of view of there's black and white, there's good and bad, frankly, I think that attitude leads us into risk aversion, because you're not looking at harmony and pulling together. Because the idea of yin and yang, for example, is to create this harmony and this unity of forces. So you're not just thinking unilaterally one or the other. They're all together. Everything relates to each other. And again, this is part of life, not just design, not just innovation. It's a duality. It's a marrying of the opposites that works. And there's some wonderful books, articles on duality, a lot of stuff on the internet. So I encourage you to look at that. Duality, there's a theory of opposition. There's a book called the Yi Jing, which is one of the oldest books in the world. All of these texts and these references give an insight into the attitude of this harmony and working together. So without light, there is no shadow. That's a pretty powerful statement. Think about it. And that's what the Eastern philosophers that they were making. There has to be something to compare with, or else you don't have another element. In other words, you have to have something to contrast to, something to compare to. If you don't have bad, how do you know that it's good? That point. So at any rate, this is a fairly fundamental thought. And without tension, there's no progress. And the tension that we saw in that musical presentation, again, it typified that. the different rhythms and the syncopation and how all that worked together was absolutely beautiful in terms of a way to express this idea. George Bernard Shaw once said that a reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man adapts the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends upon the unreasonable man. It's just a George Bernard Shaw. It's just terrific. So I want to, I'd like to thank the organizers of TEDx Savannah for giving me the opportunity to do this. I knew Ricky Saul Werman back in the early days when he first set up TED in Monterey. I was fortunate enough to go to a number of the TEDx conferences when they were held there. And it's wonderful for me to see how it's grown now since those early days of technology, entertainment, and design to this worldwide phenomenon of sharing information. And so this is special for me to do this based on the fact that I was around with Ricky when he first set that up. So this is special. Thank you very much.